But sadly, we think that there are many worrying signs that locals are losing their right to participate in the broader planning process, both in Moreland and across Victoria. And you can see it in all sorts of ways. You know, in recent years, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal has raised fees that would allow people to participate in appeals and reviews of planning decisions, making it harder for working people to stand up against the developers who often have QCs and barristers coming out of their pockets to persecute their case. We've seen through Moreland Council attempts to trade away rights around things like notification or the right to appeal planning decisions. And one of the latest controversial things, and really the topic that we're discussing today, is around the Design Excellence Scorecard. The scorecard, in short, was dreamed up in 2017, was introduced in a trial in 2019, but I won't go on about it because we have four really excellent speakers who are going to contribute to the discussion about the scorecard and indeed what's coming up, because at the next meeting in October, Moreland City Council at their regular monthly meeting will be moving to move the scorecard from just being a trial to being a permanent part of the Moreland planning scheme. And for Brunswick Residents Network, we don't think that's a good idea. And we wanted to have this discussion. Our four speakers today, we'll start off with Stephen Rowley. Stephen's had a long career in urban planning, wearing a number of hats, both as an academic, as a writer, and as a practitioner, including a stint at Moreland City Council. He's a key advocate around improving Victoria's planning system, and he literally wrote the book called The Victorian Planning System. And if people really want to get into the nitty-gritty, that book's worth borrowing from the library or paying him some royalties. He'll be starting off the discussion today. Then we have a number of community participants who'll add and respond to some of the things that have been raised, including Joanna Stanley from the Brunswick Residents Network, Tim Glanville from the Northeast Brunswick Responsible Development Group, and Sal Carta, who's a resident, been involved in the battle around the scorecard in Coburg with Linda and White Street. And there are other participants from that local residents' action who may want to join in the discussion. As I say, after the presentations, we'll try and keep them focused. We will have time for discussion, for comments on the presentations, for comments about your experience, and indeed some discussion about what we can do between now and mid-October when this issue will be before the council. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. For those that have just logged on, if you don't mind keeping on mute until we have the discussion period, and we'll hand over to Stephen Rowley, our first speaker. Thank you. Stephen, I'll give you a nod at 10 minutes. And
no worries. Thank you, Nick. Sorry, I'm just fiddling with my Zoom here. So as Nick has said, I'm a planner, and I suppose I'm interested in doing a couple of things today. So I suppose as a planner, I can outline some of the background and some of the technical background about how this works. And, you know, I used to work at Moreland. I left Moreland in 2014, so I follow things in Moreland with some interest. And so I've had some interest in the way the design scorecard works. So I'm happy to explain that background, but then I've got fairly considerable concerns, despite the fact that this is a lot of my old former colleagues have worked on this. It's something that I have a pretty fundamental concern with. And so in the second part of my presentation, I want to run through what the basis for those concerns are. So in terms of explaining the scorecard and how it works, there are probably a couple of bits of basic background information I should lay out. And I apologise because a lot of you are resident advocates and have dealt with the planning system. I appreciate some of you will know this, but I think it's important to spell out. So the first thing is just to briefly explain about delegation at councils. So planning powers are given to council laws under the Planning and Environment Act, but councils generally use a process called delegation to actually hand over most of the day-to-day stuff to planning officers. Typically at Moreland and other councils, that's 95% or more of applications are decided by officers And then there's usually a set of rules around which decisions the officers have to send to council. And essentially, this is an internal agreement in place at a council between the council laws and its administration saying, if you get more than a certain number of objections, we want it to go to a council meeting. If it exceeds the height limits in our structure plan, we want it to go to a council meeting. And there's usually a series of criteria. The important thing to understand is that those are typically just guidelines that trigger when the officers will proactively send it to council. It has always been the case at every council I've worked at, and I think is pretty much a nearly universal practice, that if councils want to see an application, they can. And the reason for that is it's their decision-making power. They're delegating it to officers, but if a resident gets in touch with a councillor and says, I think you should look at this one, I think it raises an unusual issue, it's the councillor's right then to essentially call that application in for a council decision. So that's the first thing about how delegation normally works. The other thing that I think is just important to understand where the scorecard has come from is understanding the limits around what councils can ask for when they're doing a planning assessment, and what in particular, what either council laws or planning officers can ask for when they do a planning assessment. And that's because planning officers and council laws and VCAT for that matter are all making assessment against the planning scheme, and they can only ask things of the developer that have a basis. Sorry, we've got someone on not on mute. They can only ask things of a developer that have some basis in the planning scheme. And if I say, and there's been a lot of debate over 10, 15 years now about sustainability standards for buildings, for example. If I, as a council officer, was assessing a proposal and said, I want you to design a really high standard environmental building, if that's beyond what the planning scheme says, and if the council hasn't been able to get the state government to let it put higher standards in its planning scheme, then it's likely those requirements get struck out of VCAT. And it means that there are limits around the policy outcomes that councils can easily get around things like ESD. Affordable housing is the other classic. Councils can't just ask for affordable housing contributions from developers because there's limits to what's in the planning scheme. And similarly, councils can't ask developers for contributions around things like upgrades to parks. Well, parks are a bad example because there is specific provisions of that, but general sort of public realm improvements, upgrading roads or whatever, unless it's very, very clearly linked to the effect that a development's going to have. This brings us to the scorecard, because what's essentially happened in Moreland, in my read, and I'm trying to be sort of generous to the designers of the scorecard when I explain this, is they've essentially looked at, well, how can we get things like affordable housing contributions? How can we get public realm improvements from developers? How can we get developers to contribute these things to the community? And that's a laudable goal. But because they've got very limited ability to require the developer to do these things, they have to give something in exchange. And what the design scorecard essentially says is, well, if you can give us these extra nice to have things, we will guarantee you a faster decision. And the way that they will guarantee you a faster decision is by essentially saying, this will not go to a council meeting if you do these things. And those things are very much based around, while there is a general reference to kind of like, it's got to be design excellence, which is a very subjective thing. The kind of things, if you look at the scorecard that they're asking for, are the kind of things that are really, really hard for planners to ask for normally. And essentially what you are doing then is to achieve that goal, you're essentially saying the councillors will surrender their powers to the council officers. The council officers will then decide whether something meets the scorecard and is of this sort of excellence against the scorecard and gives council these nice to have things. And essentially you're using that time saving by not sending it to a council meeting as a bargaining chip with the developer to get things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. Now, the difficulty here is to make that an effective bargaining chip, you have to give the developer certainty. You can't just say, if you meet this scorecard, you probably won't go to a council meeting. You have to essentially promise, and if you look at the language on the website and in the scorecard, developers are promised that if they meet the scorecard, they won't be going to a council meeting. It essentially requires councillors to surrender their ability to call in applications on an ad hoc basis. So at the start, I said that there are always rules around delegation. But even if something doesn't meet the normal rules, councillors normally retain the ability to call something in if something raises unusual issues or if they just decide they want to see it. And it's the giving up and the surrendering of that discretion by the councillors to bring something in on their say-so that I find really fundamentally problematic. So if we start to turn to what my basic concerns are, the first is just an in-principle concern. Planning powers are democratically vested powers. Now, I'm a professional planner. I've spent a lot of my career working for local government. As a council officer, I was often frustrated when I'd make recommendations and recommendations would go to councillors and councillors would overturn my recommendations. But we're in a democracy. That's the way it works. It is, in my view, just as a fundamental starting principle, inappropriate for councillors to be surrendering their democratically vested powers to planning officials, no matter how well they might go about that task, no matter how much they're doing it in good faith. And, you know, I know a lot of these planners and I'm sure they're doing it with the best of intentions. It's just fundamentally inappropriate to give that power up. The planning system sets up democratic powers at council and with the planning minister for that matter, and it places them in tension with expert-based bodies like the Appeals Tribunal, and it sets up a deliberate tension. It wasn't contemplated in the Act, and it is, in my view, an overreach in the way delegation is supposed to be set up to essentially trade away the democratic role of councillors in representing people at the starting stage of the planning process. You're essentially taking out a point that the legislation says is supposed to be democratic and saying, no, at that point it won't be democratic. And I find that sort of really fundamentally problematic. And what you're essentially doing is you're trading off what I would see is a fundamental tenet of the system, and what I would say is a must-have, the democratic representation, for the nice-to-haves, the additional sustainability standards, the additional contributions to public realm improvements, all the other things you might get under the scorecard. Those are the nice-to-haves. You shouldn't be trading off a fundamentalist system for the nice-to-haves. And fundamentally, I'd say they're not your rights to trade off. So I'm saying if you're a councillor, it's the people's rights to be involved in the process. It's the people's rights to be represented through you as councillors that you're trading. They shouldn't be a bargaining chip. So let's just sort of work through that as well. I think there's a slippage here in the role that planning is supposed to take. Planning is supposed to be a process of regulating development and assessing development against planning schemes. And by essentially moving to the realm of, well, how can we get developers to do things that are beyond what the planning scheme says? They are essentially placing the planners in the role of sort of deal makers. And the problem is, because planners can't ask for things that aren't in the planning scheme normally, you're going into that negotiation process from a position of weakness. You're essentially saying, well, we need to find some way to have leverage in this process. And so that's why you get to this point of essentially making deals using things you shouldn't be trading away, which is the democratic process. And you could say, well, all right, that's probably not going to be too much of a concern because the scorecard is hopefully going to make sure that those developments are going to be excellent. The classic problem with it is that the design scorecard is only going into detail on certain things like sustainability and public realm improvements. It doesn't have detailed amenity standards in terms of impacts on neighbours. It doesn't reference things like preferred heights in things like the structure plans. And essentially what it means is that there are going to be a whole lot of things that might warrant a call in that councillors should be able to form judgments on that are outside the realm of these extra benefits you get from the scorecard.
Stephen, five more minutes?
Yep.
Five more minutes?
Yep. And so what I'd say is the other thing that's really important to understand about that is that things like the amenity standards, particularly for higher buildings in areas like growth areas, which obviously Brunswick and Moreland has a lot of. It's not as simple as just saying, for example, that the buildings have to comply with the amenity standards in the planning scheme, because those standards are very subjective and they're very open to interpretation. And so it does mean that there's a lot of room for legitimate differences of opinion between an officer's view and a council law's view. And while the officers are going to have their view as a professional based on, for example, how it's likely to go at VCAT, the elected officials' view is really legitimate as well. And there is room for legitimate differences of opinion in terms of what amenity standards should apply for neighbours next to these developments. And councillors, in my view, if they give those rights over fully to the officers, they're essentially abdicating their view, abdicating their responsibility, I should say, to remain essentially with their hands on the wheel of this sort of self-driving car. I just want to really quickly finish off with a couple of procedural concerns. The first is that the scorecard compliance has to be certified by a planning officer before it goes on public notice. That's really problematic in my view, as someone who's handled many, many hundreds of planning applications over the years. And the reason I say that is because the process you have to go through as a planning decision maker is to assess compliance against the planning scheme, yes, but you also have to consider objections. And the danger is that what you're essentially doing is asking the planner to commit to a position before they've given public notice. Because they have to certify the scorecard compliance before they've gone out to public notice, you've essentially asked the planner to form a position on it before they've properly considered the objections. And I'm sure, an officer defending the scorecard will say, well, no, they can still come back to it later if the objections raise new issues. But I would say the planner at that stage is essentially prejudged the application earlier in the process than they should be doing. And that essentially, in my view, potentially perverts the course of the normal application notice process that's supposed to be gone through. A related point is the role of council laws in planning information discussion meetings. There's consultation meetings usually often held with the more contentious applications at the end of the process. And I note that in the information Moreland provide, they say, oh, well, council laws can come to those meetings. And so there's obviously a attempt to sort of satisfy the community that council laws are still involved. What I would say, and for the council laws listening, if you're going to those meetings under this process, you are not a council law, you are just a regular citizen. And that is because you don't have the ability to act on the information that you hear in those meetings because you can't call the application in under this system. So the question arises, either the council is saying, the process is saying, you can't call it in and there's no influence you can have on the process, in which case your involvement in those planning information discussion meetings is essentially a form of sham consultation. I think is just sort of consultation theatre. The other possibility is that if you're unhappy with the proposal, you can communicate that to the council officers. That raises concerns about back channel communication. There is not supposed to be a process whereby council laws are privately communicating their views to council officers. The way it's supposed to work is exactly the process that's foreclosed by the scorecard, in that council officers are supposed to put a report up and the council laws can vote on it. Councillors shouldn't be giving any direction to council officers. So my question is, after this planning information discussion meeting, I don't understand how the role of councillors is supposed to play out. And the final thing I'll say, Nick, because I know I need to be wrapping up, is there's a fundamental question to me about enforceability of the bonuses you get under this scheme. The whole point of this exercise is to get things that you couldn't otherwise require of developers. So in other words, you'll be issuing a planning permit at the end of this process with requirements about, no gas utilities or higher sustainability standards than you might otherwise be able to. Because those don't have a basis in the planning scheme, the planning applicant, and it may not be the same person, you might have a developer acting in perfectly good faith that sells on the site, someone else can come on and say, hang on, these conditions are beyond what the planning scheme says. I'm going to take those conditions to VCAT. I'm going to seek a variation to the permit. And I would have real questions about, in the long term, whether some of these bonuses that you're getting in exchange for this surrendering of rights, I'd have a real question as to whether you're going to be able to lock them in as effectively as you want. So in my view, the Design Excellence Scorecard it's well-intentioned. Again, I know the people involved. It's been done with the best of intentions, but in my view, it crosses a really fundamental line. It shouldn't have been proposed. In my view, it should never have gone to a trial. It's so fundamentally ill-conceived, it shouldn't have gone to a trial. And I really urge the councils who are here not to make it permanent. It is, in my view, crossing a line. And I would say to all of you and those of you involved with the Brunswick, with the different community groups here, to be communicating to your councillors that you don't think it should be supported. I think it's really inappropriate. I'll stop there, Nick, because I've probably already gone over time. But yeah, thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much for that broad introduction. It really flags a number of concerns that different people have raised. And we want to get some input and responses from members of community groups that have had experience with the scorecard. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge, as well as Councillors Bolton and Conlon, Councillor Mark Rowley, the Deputy Mayor of Moreland, has joined us. So thank you, Mark, for joining us this afternoon. And there's one or two staff I noticed in the group as well, who I hope are taking notes. So thank you very much, Stephen. And I'll hand over to our next speaker, Joanna Stanley. Jo's a member of Brunswick Residents Network and has been involved in a number of planning issues around the South Ward and indeed beyond that. So thank you, Jo.
Thanks, Nick, and hello to the councillors. I feel like I'm in planning panels or in VCAT because I'm usually, after Stephen's spoken, I say, wow, thanks for having me, and I really need to concur and endorse everything Stephen just said, because I do. But this is much more relaxed, and I haven't prepared a submission and I haven't really prepared much, but I really just wanted to talk about a few examples, but one in particular of a group of residents. So I have a background of speaking on behalf of residents groups, giving them more of a voice in the system. And this year, Brunswick Residents Network, actually from early this year, I think it started with residents contacting Nancy and over the same issue of a development at 215 to 219 Albion Street, which had been advertised December 18 of last year and received 22 objections. It was a scorecard application for a multi-unit development of, which will be right on our upfield bike path at basically the railway line on Albion Street. The residents didn't feel like they had been taken any notice of at the planning information meeting, but also the application had gone in September before the pilot had been renewed for an extra trial, and there wasn't any extra measures that the councillors were going to be notified on this. So I'm still not sure if they actually are going to be notified on scorecard applications or not, and that's something we do need to look at before the decision is made. But I mean, so overall, the feedback from this group of residents was prolific. It went on and on and on, and we kept getting contacts. And an objector who had filed at VCAT eventually, because the delegate report, obviously, as Stephen mentioned, when you go through the scorecard as a developer, it's already decided because they're not going to reject something through the scorecard. So it's obviously going to get a permit. So it did go to the point of having an object to file. And at that point, I had to step in, because in the first week of filing at VCAT, the objector had received multiple direct messages, which I have copies of from the developer, actually a consultant of the developer who was employed to try to negotiate, and had basically left messages and spoken to the objector to withdraw the application, and had left 17 messages over a period of about 15 days, not at weekends. So they felt very stressed and very upset about this. So I did take the developers on and talk them through how inappropriate that was once the review system had started. But what was more extraordinary was that Moreland Council had offered a room and to facilitate the meeting in order to persuade the developer to withdraw. So this whole, I guess, by having an alternate, what I see the DES, the Design Excellence Scorecard, as being it's an alternative process. It just opens the door. It's like the thin end of the wedge. Once you start an alternative process, what else can happen within that process? So we've seen Moreland offer the Moreland staff offer their facilities, which I believe was highly inappropriate in the first, in the lead up to a VCAT decision. And I guess the big scheme of things with residents is, they feel like they had a chance to negotiate at the planning information meeting, but they weren't listened to. No changes were made. They don't felt they had any rights whatsoever. So I guess that's where what I really wanted to say is that once you start a new avenue for a process of permitting developments, what can happen within that, So something else is that, some developers have rockstar status in this municipality, and that is the situation. So when they go through the scorecard, they're guaranteed extra meetings, and I don't have an issue with having a proper process, with having a proper assessment of design and a development plan. But it's sort of the whole idea that we're going to, the staff are saying, we're going to give you extra meetings, we're going to give you a specialist delegate who's going to work with you from the beginning of this to the very end, to the building permit process. It's almost like selling up this avenue as something that, it's a bonus. Let's jump into bed together, let's stick around together and see these developments through. But what could go wrong there? I know, anyway, look, I just wanted to bring that up. So what else have I got? Delegate reports are very, very interesting, but you've got to remember delegates are, they have their own views, and the staff at Moreland office often overworked, and they tend, Moreland tends to attract, in my opinion, sort of wide-eyed officers who really think they can make a difference, which is absolutely fabulous. But when you're putting that in the mix with sort of greenwashed situations, and also taking away, the democratic rights for councils to be involved and for the residents to actually influence that decision, really sort of putting a cocktail in a blender that's just going to explode, in my opinion. So that's really what I have to say. I guess the only other thing I wanted to mention was the internal amenity issues and the functional layouts of apartments. Stephen mentioned a few things that, residents don't really have a say. And I think that, yes, look, a lot of residents don't know about clause 58 or clause this and that. But, if they did, they still should have a right to influence a better outcome, because at the end of the day, 20 years down the track, it's our neighbours who are living in the apartments, and it's us possibly. So, we don't want those flow-on effects down the track to come back and bite us, because Moreland slightly bent the rules at the time and brought in this system. So I really want to sort of end there, and I really look forward to hearing from a couple more residents groups, and just really look forward to the discussion with the people who are here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for your contribution. I mean, I think it's worth flagging that this is a real innovation. You know, the scorecard concept in its particular structure is very much a Moreland thing. And once again, we are acting as a guinea pig for some of the developments that are happening across the inner city, and indeed are now spreading to outer suburban areas as the broader fringe is being debated. The other element in all of this is that buildings that in themselves may have some merit, if they've involved trade-offs to say give them extra height, set a precedent for other buildings nearby. VCAT always denies that they believe in things like precedents, but in Albert Street you get a 14-storey building. Every other developer says they got 14 stories, why can't I? And VCAT tends to look at that neighbourhood character at the buildings that are around. So each individual project needs to be looked as part of the broader context. We want to go to other people now who've had experience of this whole process. Tim Glanville is involved in the Northeast Brunswick Responsible Development Group. Tim's going to say a few words about the scorecard and what it means for their concerns of that part of the South Ward. Thank you, Tim. If you can just unmute on the bottom left, thanks.
I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Nick, for that. And I'd also like to thank Sue Bolton for arranging this meeting, and perhaps others such as James Conlon and others who've been involved. I represent the local community group in North East Brunswick. We think this is a very important issue. And it's good that various people can discuss it at this meeting. Now, why are we opposed to the scorecard? We're very strongly opposed to the scorecard. And it's pretty simple, really. As Stephen has explained, basically, it's anti-democratic. We want decisions to be made by our elected councillors, not by unelected officials. And this takes away the right of councillors to decide these major matters. Now, a couple of years ago, I asked Philip Priest at a council meeting, how many other councils have an arrangement similar to this? Philip was most reluctant to answer that question, and I think that's telling. Eventually he did answer, and of course the answer was no other council in Victoria of the 80 or so has such an arrangement. And I think that should give our own councillors considerable pause in cementing it in concrete. In fact, I would put it to councillors that most other councils, certainly in Melbourne, would not contemplate such an undemocratic proposal as this. Now, what are the arguments which are put against our position? And there are a number. The first argument is that, well, you know, at the moment, the bulk of decisions are just made by officials anyway. I think Stephen quoted 95%, and I've got no reason to disbelieve him. But of course, most of these decisions are on minor matters, perhaps a crossover on the footpath or something. And the community has no problems with such decisions. But what we're concerned about is the 5%, which are major decisions. The proposals where there are lots of objections. To give you one example of this, in our area, the Cypress Club is proposing a massive development in the top end of Lygon Street. There were 260 objections. And the outcome of this is very telling. The council officers who would have had the decision under the scorecard, the council officers recommended a response to that, which was rejected unanimously by councillors, unanimously. So if this proposal had been under the scorecard, the view of the officers would have carried the day. The second thing that's put to us by council officials such as Philip Priest as well, you know, of course, you can always have a public information and discussion group. We found these meetings, and we've been to many, typically to be pretty ineffective. What they typically consist of is the developer outlining their proposal, objectors outlining the reasons why they don't like it, and then the officials saying, oh, well, clearly there's nothing we can do to resolve this. So you've had your public information discussion group, you've had your PIDs, so it's on to the next phase of the process. So in our view, PIDs are not an answer to the removal of councillors' rights. The next argument that is put is that, well, you can always go to VCAT. We're not taking away your right to go to VCAT. But of course, if you're going to VCAT against a council's decision, you will be up for a very large fee, $3,000 or $4,000. What small community group can cope with that, particularly if, as in Brunswick, say, you might have to go to VCAT repeatedly. So the argument that you can always go to VCAT is not an argument in favour of the scorecard at all. In fact, groups, as I think the people in Linda Street found, once council's made the decision, you're in a bind. You've got to raise a lot of money to go to VCAT. You might also have to raise many more thousands of dollars to pay for town planning or legal representation. I'd like to make one other point. I spent my whole career as an official, a bureaucrat in the Commonwealth Government. Now, while it's true that officials might be fairly careful of these scorecard proposals in this trial period, there is a tendency for officials to make matters routine after a while. And once the scorecard is set in concrete, there will be a tendency to wave matters through, providing that the particular concerns of the official for good design are met. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the whole thing descends into a tick and flick exercise fairly quickly. Of course, this will never happen when officers are required to prepare a detailed report for the council meeting, the PALM meetings which currently occur. One thing that I like to say is that Gandhi said that good government is no substitute for self-government. In this case, we're having our self-government taken away. That is the right for our democratically elected representatives to decide these matters. But I'm not even sure that we'll get good government. In fact, I think we'll get a rather routine process of officials agreeing to things because their particular concerns on the scorecard are met. But basically, we elect our councillors. We want our elected councillors to make these decisions where there are a lot of objections, where there are major concerns. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much. And thanks for being succinct and raising some really important concerns. I think too, highlighting the point that what happens with good behaviour during the trial may not be the future once this is locked in and developers have had their way in persuading Moreland to put this not as a trial, but permanently into the Moreland planning scheme. I think it's a really important point and one that should give pause for the decision to be taken in October. Our final speaker today, Tim mentioned there's been cases where the scorecard has been used. One example is in Coburg around Linda Street and White Street, where there's a long and in some ways big disputed process. Sal Carta is with us this afternoon as one of the residents involved in that discussion around the Linda Street project. Sal, I'll hand over to you. If you have any problems with sound and we can't hear you, I'll invite someone else because there's a couple of other people in the group who may want to have a say as well, but I'll hand over to Salvatore. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you very much for the previous speakers who really, I was just listening to them and I said, oh my God, they're just going through, they're just highlighting some of the stuff that we are living. And it's, in particular, Steve, you made 3 or 4 points there that, I'll just bring up as I'm going along telling a story, which is just so obvious and so blatant that, there was one of the comments that was made on the side was saying, why are we having this conversation at all? Is sort of question that I'd want to ask. But like everybody here, I've got a lot of skin in the game. I grew up in Brunswick and Coburg. I used to live in Brunswick next to the Tip Top factory, which looks a bit very different today from 1972. And we've been in White Street since 1973, and I've got sisters and brothers and that have gone to all the local schools and the kindergartens and what have you. So we've invested in a lot of personal time and commitment in working and developing and living in the community. So there's a lot to lose for us when all this changes, if they ever go through. But the other thing that I want to say is about the group at Windsor Street. The first thing that is no one in that group was opposed to responsible development. It is what we saw and what was being proposed that just didn't fit effectively. There was way more than 30 objectives, and amongst the group were architects, engineers, teachers, planners who were supporting us, young couples with kids, pensioners, you name it. It was a variety of people in the community that were all being impacted by it. So, we all, spent decades of commitments and personal investment into the care and well-being and the longevity of the community. So we launched our complaint based on the several things, but the level of change that was being proposed in the area was one of them. For example, paying respect to the character and heritage, the amount of traffic, the population density, the overdevelopment that it was introducing into the area. A couple of the architects wrote some reports on the interior and exterior of the design of the new dwellings that were being proposed. It effectively brings in some very significant changes to a very focused area at the end of a street, which is a dead-end street adjacent to a park that's heavily used by families. And this is an area that's all classified as a minimum change. So I don't know what measure was being used to say that what they're doing is minimum change. It's something that couldn't be explained and still can be explained, but obviously the scorecard had a hand in getting it through. So our assessment, and I'm going to be very brief, and I apologise if I don't do everybody justice in the group, but our assessment was that the proposed development doesn't meet council's own policies and guidelines, and the design scorecard was being used to mask these deficiencies and prop up the development with what I would call superficial, unjustifiable, and unquantifiable benefits to the community and the environment. I think there was a lot of motherhood statements that were used. There was nothing to say, specifically, this is what it is. It was all quite difficult for us to form an opinion or argue against because, it was just too broad. It was effectively a free get out of jail card for the councillors and the developers and the planners, in our opinion. Now, if I go to the planning information and mediation meetings, they were mostly Zoom meetings. They weren't recorded. There were no formal minutes released, which is, I would consider it exceptionally unprofessional and out of sync with the expected behaviour of professional bodies. But when you follow the way the story goes, it serves a purpose for them, I guess. The meetings were not about mediation or discussion of opinions or options, but more about telling us why we were wrong and that what they did, and that we did not understand the council's decisions, their making processes. And to bring up one of Steve's points here, we felt that the council had reached its conclusion and were just going through the motion of ticking a box. And another of Steve's point is that position of weakness that's given to the planners by the scorecard when they go to negotiate with the developers is actually flowed down onto us. So now we're the weakest link, you know, in the whole process. There was no sense of independence in their decision making, but a strong sense of siding with the developer and a strong sense, we felt, of indifference towards the community. I mean, we felt that our rights to oppose the decisions were being eroded away. There were many objectors, like I said at the beginning, but most of them became despondent with the behaviour of the council's representatives, to the point that many of us felt that we all been set up for a fail. So only 3 of us took the case to VCAT, and the outcome is still pending. So we're going up against the council and the developer, so it's a worst case scenario for us. And getting ready for VCAT, it's proven incredibly draining, especially when you're not co-located. You know, 2 of us are overseas, and I had to make a special trip to Melbourne, and I've been here since because of lockdown. But you know, I wanted to put up my best foot forward. But you know, while you're trying to stay on top of COVID and keep your business viable and paying your bills, going up against the council is not the easiest thing to do. And again, as I was saying, we are now in the position of weakness. So they've transferred all that to us. You know, that to me is just passing the buck in all sorts of, you know, levels of responsibility from the planners to the councillors. So the other thing that we have a lot of difficulty is finding an advocate. You know, and we have contacted probably dozens of them. And I think Tim was saying $3,000 to $4,000. We were getting quotes of people asking upwards of $5,000 a day. That's the sort of experience that, the sort of feedback that we were getting. You know, so some of them, I don't know, some of them might have been out to fleece us, but clearly we're still looking for one. So we didn't expect, and we didn't get a lot of empathy from the council representatives or the developers when we went to our first meeting at BidCat. I mean, I felt like I was being mocked, basically, because of the level of effort that we were trying to put into you know, get ourselves ready for our meeting. But anyway, what I want to do is now, if I go back to September, you know, there was a council meeting on the September last year. There was a council meeting on the either continuing the trial with the scorecard, which, by the way, somebody said guinea pigs. I mean, yeah, we are the guinea pigs. We are having to go through the motions and suffer for it because, yeah, let's see how they go. Let's see how they fall over. Let's see how much pain we can inflict in the community. You know, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But anyway, there were things that came out at the meeting, and clearly some of them echoed what was said now. It was about the democratic process, which was going to be eroded and moved away. But there were other things that came up. And look, Dale Martin at the time said things like 100% compliance with the planning scheme, real action against climate emergency, addressing energy poverty, you know, giving people with disability more homes, and addressing, you know, affordable housing. And those are all great things. I just couldn't see how the scorecard, applying the scorecard in what we were doing, was going to deliver any of those things. I mean, one of the things it was going to deliver was a tree in somebody's front yard. I don't know how that was going to make an impact to, you know, to the solution to climate. I mean, it appears that they were chasing, you know, state and federal outcomes on a scorecard being applied at the end of a street in Coburg. Again, it just doesn't make sense to me. And that was then there was Connor and Olivia Carly Hannon. She said things like co-design and consultation and partnership. And again, those are fantastic things, but we didn't see any of it. So I'm not quite sure, you know, what, you know, They're there, they want those things, but the scorecard isn't giving it to them. And yet we're in a position again where we're having to have this conversation. You know, why are we having this conversation? But at the end of the meeting, the conclusion was effectively, let's continue with the trial and see where it gets us. And based on what I've heard today and what I've been hearing in the community is, it's just created more chaos and more confusion and more frustration amongst the residents. So I don't think we need it. I'm a certified engineer. I'm a registered engineer. If I work with a lot of other people in a lot of fields of engineering that are not necessarily my specialty, but this scorecard is an anomaly. You know, you either have your basics right and your policies are correct, or you know, and they're clear about what you need the planners to achieve or the developers to achieve, and then you measure against that, not, you know, have something in between. And I think Tim was talking about no other councils having it, and there's a reason for that, I guess. You know, it's because in my opinion, it doesn't make sense. It's not delivering the outcomes that are being sought. I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching before it goes ahead. But look, that's all I wanted to say. I'm happy to provide more information, you know, as the conversation goes through, but I didn't want to take up too much time so that we have more time for questions and comments.
Perfect timing, Salvatore. Thank you, because that's in fact exactly what we're doing. We'll move on to some discussion, some questions and comments. Can I flag one of the reasons we organised this meeting was to share information. These things are happening all over our municipality, in the north, in the south. Brunswick Residents Network, as the name suggests, is a network trying to link up people who've got experience of dealing with the planning system, both successes and failures. We put out a monthly newsletter, and we try and hold public events like this to, you know, get people involved and think about what's best for the community. So thank you for joining us this afternoon.